The most fundamental distinction that Rudolf Steiner established to understand the deep nature of human experience and the inner tensions that everyone experiences, but that few clearly understand, does not appear in any conventional psychology text, nor is it taught in philosophy courses that operate exclusively within materialist paradigms, but it permeates all of his anthroposophical work, revealing that what we experience as self is not a single, indivisible entity, but is in fact a complex overlap of two distinct centers of consciousness, operating simultaneously but often in opposite directions, creating inner conflicts that they manifest as paralyzing indecision or as a disturbing sensation of being torn between what you know you should do and what you actually do, between high aspirations and low impulses, between understanding universal truths and attachments to particular desires, between the ability to observe life with philosophical detachment and the need to be completely immersed in intense emotional experiences that characterize incarnated human existence. These two yous that Steiner identified are not mere theoretical abstractions, nor are they just different aspects of personality that could be integrated through conventional therapy, but are literally two levels of being that exist in different dimensions of reality and that have fundamentally distinct natures. Lower self, that is temporal personality, constructed through identification with the physical body, with astral body emotions and desires, with current life memories and thought. Patterns, and with social roles and identities that have been established through processes of socialization beginning in childhood and continuing through of life, creating a sense of self that is completely involved in the dramas and urgencies of material existence, experiencing everything from within limitations of singular perspective, that sees reality only from a particular point of view, with no ability to transcend immediate circumstances to see larger patterns, and higher self that is immortal spiritual core that transcends any particular incarnation, observing life from perspective that is not limited to linear time or physical space, but that sees complete arc of development through multiple lives, recognizing that present experiences are part of much larger journey that has purposes that are not apparent when only fragments, isolates of current biography are considered, without understanding contexts that connect this life with developments that preceded birth and that will continue after death in cycles of reincarnation through which the soul progressively develops capacities and wisdoms that are true goals of human existence, completely transcending mere goals of material survival and reproduction that are sufficient for animals, but that are not satisfactory for human beings who have spiritual needs that must be met if life is to have meaning that goes beyond the mere passage of time between birth and death. The relationship between these two levels of self is not simply hierarchical, where one is superior and the other is inferior in sense of value or importance, but is complementary where each has specific functions that are necessary for successful navigation of incarnated existence, which requires both the ability to be fully present and engaged with practical challenges of material life, and the ability to maintain broader perspective that sees meanings that transcend immediate situations, preventing one from becoming completely lost in identification with temporary aspects of being completely forgetting eternal dimensions that are who one truly is in essence, deeper. Lower self is necessary to function effectively in the physical world because it requires focus on immediate details and the ability to respond quickly to constantly changing situations without having to consider all the cosmic ramifications of every small choice, which would be paralyzing if one tried to always operate from a higher self perspective that sees everything in contexts of eternity, making it difficult to give appropriate importance to temporal urgencies, which, although ephemeral on a cosmic scale, are still real and important on an individual human life scale, where decisions about what to eat for dinner or how to respond to colleague comment can have significant consequences for immediate well-being, even when they are not ultimately important when viewed from the perspective of developments across multiple lifetimes. But lower self alone, without connection to higher self, becomes lost in a labyrinth of superficial concerns and automatic emotional reactions, without guidance from deeper values or understanding of greater purposes that could inform choices with wisdom that comes from levels that transcend immediate ego reasoning operating only with limited information from prior experience. Feels without access to reservoirs of knowledge accumulated through multiple incarnations that higher self possesses, but that are not normally accessible to ordinary consciousness that is exclusively identified with lower self, living only on the surface of appearances, without touching depths where real truths reside, waiting to be discovered through practices that create bridges between levels, allowing higher self-wisdom to inform lower self choices, rather than there being just division where two levels operate independently, creating inner conflicts, when impulses from higher self that wants to live according to universal principles and evolutionary purposes contradict desires of the lower self that wants immediate satisfaction and personal security without considering whether choices serve greater development or merely gratify momentary needs, that when satisfied bring temporary pleasure, but do not bring lasting satisfaction, that only comes when life is lived in alignment with authentic purposes that the higher self knows, but that the lower self often ignores because it is too busy with superficial urgencies to listen to the quiet voice of inner guidance that is always present, but that is easily drowned out by the noise of automatic thoughts and emotional reactions that dominate ordinary consciousness when there are no practices cultivating the ability to quiet the mind sufficiently to allow deeper dimensions to become audible. Spiritual development, according to Steiner, is not a matter of eliminating lower self, nor of completely transcending needs of material existence in favor of living exclusively from a higher self perspective that would be unsuitable for navigation of incarnated life that requires practical engagement with concrete challenges, but is a matter of establishing correct relationship between levels where higher self provides guidance and general direction based on understanding of higher purposes, while lower self executes practical choices within frameworks established by higher self, rather than operating autonomously, according only to impulses and conditioning that do not take into account the general direction of life, is aligned with developments that soul came to accomplish in this particular incarnation. This integration between levels does not happen automatically, nor is it guaranteed simply by being incarnated, but requires conscious and deliberate work to cultivate awareness of the higher self through meditative practices that create quiet spaces where ordinary consciousness identified with the lower self can temporarily release identifications with thoughts, emotion sensations that normally dominate experience, allowing the witnessing dimension of the higher self to be recognized directly as a presence that observes all contents of consciousness without being identical to any particular content, revealing that there is an aspect of being that transcends all temporary phenomena, remaining as a stable foundation through all changes that occur at levels more superficial of personality and circumstances. When this testimonial dimension is recognized through direct experience not only as an intellectual concept, but as a lived reality, the person begins to identify progressively not only with the lower self that is involved in dramas and is subject to sufferings of material existence, but also and eventually primarily with the higher self that observes everything with equanimity, recognizing that although experiences are real and important, they are not the totality of who they are because there's a dimension that transcends all particular experiences, maintaining continuity through birth, death, and all life transformations, providing a sense of identity that does not depend on external circumstances or of internal states that inevitably fluctuate through time, but that remain constant as pure awareness that is the essential nature of the higher self, not subject to changes that affect more superficial levels of being. The specific practices that Steiner recommended for cultivating conscious connection between the lower self and higher self begin with simple concentration exercises, where attention is deliberately focused on a chosen object, maintaining focus without allowing the mind to wander, developing the ability to direct awareness voluntarily rather than being passively swept along by currents of automatic associations that characterize undisciplined thinking, progressing through more complex meditations, where the person observes one's own processes of thought and emotion without identifying with them, developing the ability to be a witness to inner experience, creating distance between the observer and the observed, which is essential to recognizing that self. Higher is observer, who is not identical with contents being observed, and eventually reaching advanced practices where a person can deliberately move consciousness between levels, alternately experiencing identification with lower self-living experiences intensely from within and identifying with higher self, observing same experiences from a detached perspective that sees patterns and meanings that are not apparent when there is only immersion without the ability to transcend, to see from a higher altitude. This ability to move fluidly between perspectives is a mark of mature spiritual development where one is not stuck at any one level exclusively, but can operate on both as the situation requires, utilizing lower self-engagement when practical action is required, and higher self-perspective when decisions about general life direction must be made, or when deeper meanings of experiences must be understood by integrating both aspects into harmonious functioning that utilizes forces from each level. Appropriately, rather than having chronic conflict where lower self wants one thing and higher self wants another, resulting in paralysis or inaction that is always accompanied by guilt, because any choice betrays one of the levels creating inner division that is the source of much human suffering, when correct relationship between levels has not been established through conscious work of spiritual development. The lived experience of having two levels of self operating simultaneously manifests itself in ways that are familiar to to anyone who has ever had moments of self-observation, where part of oneself was completely absorbed in emotion or activity, while another part was observing with almost clinical curiosity, noticing what was happening without being lost in total identification with experience, being nervous before an important presentation, and simultaneously observing one's own nervousness with almost detached interest, noticing how one's heart races and hands tremble as thoughts circle anxiously, being furious with someone else, feeling anger burn through the body and desire, expressing oneself violently, and at the same time observing this anger, recognizing that it is a disproportionate reaction based on old patterns that have nothing to do with the present situation. Being in love, feeling euphoria and an intense desire to be with a loved one, and simultaneously skeptically asking if these feelings are real or are they just projections and fantasies that will inevitably disappear when the initial phase of passion passes, revealing that there was just infatuation without real substance. These moments of divided consciousness are not pathological, nor are they signs of dissociation, but are natural glimpses of the dual structure of a human being that has both the lower self immersed in experiences and the higher self observing from a distance, maintaining perspective that is not possible when there is only total identification with emotional states or external situations, without the ability to transcend to see from a broader point of view that recognizes relativity and impermanence of everything that happens on temporal levels of existence. The challenge that most people face is not a lack of access to the higher self, because everyone has occasional moments of expanded awareness where a broader perspective emerges spontaneously. But it is an inability to maintain this connection stably over time, because identification with the lower self is so strong and so constantly reinforced through a culture that values only material and temporal aspects of life that moments of connection with the higher self are treated as interesting but non-significant anomalies that are quickly forgotten when attention returns to ordinary concerns of everyday life that completely absorb awareness, leaving no room for deeper dimensions that require stillness and reflection to be accessed consistently, rather than just occasionally when special circumstances create temporary openings. Establishing a stable connection between levels requires not only isolated meditative practices, but transformation of how one's entire life is lived by creating regular spaces for cultivating inner life and making choices that reflect higher self-values, rather than just serving lower self desires, developing through years of consistent practice the ability to operate from both levels as the situation requires, rather than being stuck exclusively in a lower self perspective, which is the default condition of most people in modern culture, which provides neither support nor guidance for developing conscious connection with spiritual dimensions of being, which, although are real and important, are systematically ignored or denied as irrelevant to practical life, resulting in the vast majority of people living entire lives without ever recognizing or developing a relationship with the higher self, remaining identified exclusively with the lower self, which, when lacking guidance from deeper levels, becomes lost in the pursuit of superficial goals that never bring lasting satisfaction because they do not touch real soul needs that can only be satisfied. This is done when there is alignment between lived life and purposes that the higher self knows but that the lower self ignores when it is operating autonomously without connection to an inner source of wisdom and guidance. The transformation that happens when correct relationship between higher self and lower self is established is not elimination of challenges or guarantee of an easy life, but is fundamental change in how challenges are experienced and in quality of consciousness brought to all situations where even severe difficulties can be navigated with equanimity that comes from recognizing that although experiences are intense and real at the lower self level, there is also a higher self perspective that sees everything in larger contexts, recognizing that nothing is permanent and that even deeper sufferings are temporary phases on a very long journey. Greater, that has purposes that transcend immediate comfort or conventional success, including development of capabilities and wisdoms that only through facing difficulties can be cultivated, transforming what appear to be just obstacles into opportunities when they are viewed from a perspective that recognizes that genuine growth always involves the discomfort of stretching beyond established comfort zones toward possibilities that cannot be achieved without the courage to face the unknown and uncertainty that always accompany true development, as distinguished from the mere acquisition of technical skills or informational knowledge that can be obtained without fundamental transformation of consciousness. That is the mark of genuine spiritual development operating in levels that transcend just improvements in functioning in the material world, to include expansion of consciousness and deepening of understanding about the nature of reality and meaning of human existence that cannot be reduced to simple formulas, nor can it be conveyed adequately through words requiring direct experience that each person must cultivate through their own work of development that no one can do for another, because It involves inner transformations that can only happen through individual efforts, even when guidance from teachers and support from communities can facilitate the process by providing maps and encouragement, but cannot replace the real work that each person must do of reconnecting themselves consciously with the higher self that has always been present, but that has been forgotten through exclusive identification with the lower self, which is a natural condition of the beginning of life, but which must be eventually transcended if spiritual development is to occur, allowing the person to operate from both levels, integrating wisdom of eternity with practical engagement in time, providing a stable foundation for navigation of all circumstances that life presents without being completely swept away by external events, nor being so detached that they lose the ability to respond appropriately to situations that require decisive action and emotional engagement, which are legitimate and necessary aspects of incarnated existence that should not be denied in the name of spiritual development that would be one-sided and inappropriate for realities of human life that operate simultaneously in multiple dimensions, all requiring appropriate attention and development if true integration is to be achieved instead of there being only division where spiritual dimensions are cultivated at the expense of practical capabilities, or vice versa, creating imbalances that, although common, are not inevitable and can be avoided through an approach that recognizes the legitimacy and necessity of both aspects of being human working to integrate instead of sacrificing one in favor of the other by developing the ability to move fluidly between perspectives. Depending on the situation, requires utilizing strengths of each level appropriately rather than being stuck in any extreme, exclusively whether materialism that denies spiritual dimensions completely or spiritual escapism that rejects material responsibilities in the name of seeking transcendence, which, when genuine, does not require abandonment of the world, but rather more conscious and effective engagement based on deeper understanding of purposes that serve not just personal interests, but evolutionary development of humanity as a totality, of which each individual is a part contributing through developments of their own to the elevation of collective consciousness that progresses through the accumulated efforts of many across generations, each adding increments that seem small, but that cumulatively create transformations that fundamentally change what is possible for human beings, as capabilities that were latent become manifest through the patient labors of countless individuals dedicating lives to developing potentials that benefit not only themselves, but all who come after inheriting the fruits of the efforts of predecessors, who prepared Caimeninos, making subsequent developments more accessible than they were to pioneers, who had to discover everything through trial and error without guidance from established traditions that now exist, by providing maps and methods that facilitate journeys of contemporary seekers who have the advantage of being able to learn from the accumulated experiences of millennia of explorers of inner dimensions who have documented discoveries through teachings and practices that have been preserved and transmitted through lineages of masters and students, each generation refining and expanding understandings based on insights from previous generations, creating body of spiritual knowledge that is humanity's common heritage available for anyone who has the sincerity to seek and the dedication to work through practices that, although simple in principle, require consistency and patience that are rare in a modern culture that values quick results and immediate gratification over profound developments that necessarily take time because they involve fundamental transformations of consciousness that cannot be rushed without creating problems of unbalanced development where capabilities are forced to emerge prematurely without appropriate foundations, resulting in vulnerabilities and distortions that cause more problems than benefits, demonstrating the need to respect natural rhythms of spiritual development that, although they may be facilitated through appropriate practices, cannot be forced beyond speeds that the total organism of body, mind, and spirit can healthily integrate without creating stress that would be counterproductive to developmental goals that include not only expansion of capabilities, but also harmonization of all aspects of being into integrated functioning that serves total well-being rather than sacrificing some dimensions in favor of others, creating imbalances that, although may appear impressive in the short term, prove to be unsustainable in the long term because they violate principles of holistic development that recognizes interdependence of all dimensions of being that must be respected if integral health is to be maintained by allowing developments to occur in ways that support life rather than undermining, through forcing one-sided growth that creates compensatory vulnerabilities in areas that have been neglected, demonstrating wisdom of a balanced approach that cultivates all aspects of being human, recognizing that each dimension has a role to play in total functioning, which requires harmonious coordination between physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual levels, all contributing to wholeness, which is the ultimate goal of development, which is not attainment of isolated, exalted states of ordinary life, but as integration of all dimensions into unified functioning, which allows person to operate effectively in material world while maintaining conscious connection with spiritual dimensions that provide guidance and meaning. Transforming life from fragmented existence into coherent journey-serving purposes that transcend singular biography, connecting person with larger evolutionary processes of which he is part and to which he contributes through individual developments, which when genuine benefit not only self but totality of humanity, which progresses through elevation of consciousness of each member, contributing to elevation of collective consciousness, which is shared destiny of human species, moving progressively towards achievements which currently only can be glimpsed, but real possibilities waiting to be manifested through the dedicated work of many over a long period of time, demonstrating that there are two, you not as a problematic division, but as a necessary structure of being human that allows for both immersion in experiences and detached observation, integrating both into the ability to live fully, while maintaining perspective that sees meanings transcending immediate situations, allowing for wise navigation of life that honors both temporal needs and eternal purposes, recognizing legitimacy of both, and working to integrate into harmonious functioning that is the mark of mature spiritual development, where a person is not divided between levels, but operates fluidly on both, as the situation requires utilizing complementary forces of lower self and higher self, rather than being in chronic conflict, which is the default condition when correct relationship has not been established through conscious work of development, which is the responsibility and opportunity of every human being who has the innate capacity to recognize and develop connection with higher self, which has always been present, waiting to be discovered. Through practices that remove veils of exclusive identification with lower self, revealing deeper dimensions of being, which when recognized completely transform living experience, making even ordinary moments meaningful when they are lived with awareness of both levels operating harmoniously in service of development, which is the fundamental purpose of human existence, completely transcending superficial objectives of material accumulation or social success, which, although they can be pursued, legitimately are not sufficient to satisfy deep needs of the soul, which can only be realized when life is lived in alignment with purposes that higher self knows and that lower self can execute, when there is conscious connection between levels, allowing wisdom to inform action and action to manifest wisdom, creating virtuous cycle of development where each level supports and enriches the other, instead of having conflict where forces are wasted on internal struggles that serve no one but only create unnecessary suffering that can be avoided by establishing right relationship based on recognition that both levels are necessary and that each has a legitimate role to play in a complete human life that integrates all dimensions into harmonious functioning, which is the goal and real possibility of spiritual development, which Steiner accurately outlined by providing practical maps that anyone can follow when they have sincerity of search and dedication to work patiently through years, developing capabilities that transform not just theoretical understanding, but lived experience of a human being who recognizes and operates consciously from both levels of self that have always been present, but which only through deliberate development become recognized and integrated, allowing the person to live fully, expressing potentials that would otherwise remain latent, never being realized because they require conscious work that most do not do, remaining identified exclusively with the lower self without ever discovering the higher self that observes and knows but remains unknown when there are no practices, creating bridges between levels, allowing wisdom of eternity to inform temporal life, transforming existence from an empty passage of time into a meaningful journey of conscious development, which is the destiny and possibility of every human being when they choose to do the work of reconnecting with deeper dimensions of being that are who they truly are beneath temporary identities and social roles that are useful, but not totality, revealing that there are two you operating simultaneously, the one who lives immersed in experiences, and the one who observes everything from a broader perspective, seeing patterns and purposes that transcend immediate situations, providing guidance and meaning that makes all the difference between living in confusion and fragmentation versus living with clarity and integration that are hallmarks of genuine spiritual development achieved through patient work of many years of cultivating conscious relationship between higher self and lower self, which, when properly established, completely transforms the experience of being human, allowing the person to operate effectively on both levels, integrating wisdom with action and eternity with time, in harmonious functioning that serves development, which is the fundamental purpose of human existence, which goes far beyond mere goals of survival and reproduction, including Evolution of consciousness, which is the shared destiny of the human species, progressively moving towards expanded capabilities which are currently only potential, but which, through the dedicated work of many across generations, will become manifest realities, demonstrating that spiritual development is not an optional luxury, but is a fundamental necessity for the full realization of human potentials that only through recognizing and integrating both levels of self can be fully expressed, allowing a person to live authentically in alignment with the deep truth of who they really are. The final and most important message that Steiner's understanding of two levels of self offers is not that there must be constant struggle between lower and higher aspects of human nature, where the objective would be to completely eliminate lower self in favor of higher self, which would be unsuitable for incarnated life, but it is that there's real possibility of establishing harmonious relationship, where each level fulfills appropriate functions, contributing to integrated functioning that utilizes strengths of both, rather than raising them in internal conflicts, that are a result of not understanding the dual structure of human consciousness, not having practices that facilitate integration between levels, allowing the person to operate consciously from both perspectives, as the situation requires developing flexibility to move between total immersion. In experiences when complete engagement is appropriate and detached observation, when broader perspective is necessary to make wise decisions about life directions, or to understand deeper meanings of experiences that, when seen only from within, without the ability to transcend, to see from altitude, remain mysterious or appear random, when in fact they have purposes that serve developments that transcend singular biography, connecting person with larger evolutionary processes that operate across multiple lives, creating continuity of development that can only be understood when higher self, that has access to this broader perspective, is recognized and consulted regularly, providing guidance that lower self alone cannot generate, because it is limited to present life information with no memory of previous lives, nor vision of future developments that higher self possesses, but that are not normally accessible to ordinary consciousness, except through deliberate practices that create openings where wisdom can flow from deeper levels to the surface of everyday consciousness, informing choices with insights that transcend logical reasoning based only on immediate information, without understanding larger contexts within which present decisions have consequences that extend far beyond the current life, affecting future developments in ways that are not apparent when only immediate results are considered, without insight into how present choices lay foundations for future possibilities that will depend on developments that are being cultivated now through each choice that is made, whether in alignment with higher self purposes or in service solely of lower self desires, which, when gratified without regard to whether they serve the greater good, often create karma that must be worked on in future lives, demonstrating the importance of establishing correct relationships between levels now through conscious work of spiritual development that transforms not only this life, but all future lives, through developing capabilities and wisdom that are accumulated through multiple incarnations, each contributing to the totality of development that is the soul's journey through eons towards achievements that justify all the efforts and suffering that were necessary to achieve them, revealing that there were purposes serving developments that completely transcend limited understandings of temporal consciousness that sees only fragments without recognizing larger patterns that connect everything into a coherent narrative that makes sense when seen from the perspective of the higher self that knows complete history, including chapters that have already been lived and chapters that will yet be lived, connecting everything into a journey that has direction and meaning, transcending appearances of randomness that characterize life when seen only from the perspective of self-inferior that does not have access to dimensions that reveal purposes, operating through multiple biographies, creating continuities that can only be recognized when there is awareness of the higher self that sees the complete arc of development through time that transcends birth and death, which from a materialistic perspective appear to be an absolute beginning and end, but from a spiritual perspective are just transitions between phases of a much greater journey that the soul is making through cycles of incarnation and disincarnation, progressively developing capabilities that will eventually allow it to operate consciously in multiple dimensions, simultaneously integrating wisdom from spiritual worlds with practical effectiveness in the material world, creating synthesis, which is humanity's evolutionary goal, when appropriate development is completed through the dedicated work of countless individuals across generations, each contributing unique steps in collective climbing, demonstrating that development of conscious relationship between higher self and lower self is not just a personal matter, but is contribution to evolution of humanity as a totality progressing through developments of individual members, raising collective consciousness, which is shared destiny of human species, moving towards capabilities that currently can only be imagined, but which are real possibilities, and waiting to be manifested when necessary work is done by enough people dedicating lives to spiritual development that benefits not only themselves, but everyone through contributing to the elevation of consciousness, which is a gradual but inexorable process that is happening over millennia, moving humanity towards futures that can only be partially glimpsed, but which are legitimate destinations of development when appropriate work is done to recognize and integrate both levels of self-operating harmoniously in the service of evolution, which is the fundamental purpose of human existence, completely transcending superficial goals of material life, which, although legitimate, are not sufficient to satisfy deep soul needs that requires conscious connection with higher self to realize the full potentials that would otherwise remain latent, never being expressed, because they require deliberate developmental work that most do not do, remaining identified exclusively with lower self that, when operating alone without guidance from deeper levels, becomes lost in pursuit of goals that never bring lasting satisfaction because they do not touch dimensions where real meanings reside, waiting to be discovered through practices that create bridges between lower self and higher self, allowing wisdom to inform life and life to manifest. Wisdom in a virtuous cycle of development that transforms existence from fragmentation to integration and from confusion to clarity, revealing that there are two, you not as a problem, but as a necessary structure, allowing for both immersion and observation, integrating both into the ability to live fully while maintaining perspective that sees meanings transcending immediate situations, providing guidance that makes all the difference between living lost versus living with clear purpose that comes from recognizing and honoring both levels of human being that, when they operate harmoniously, create life that is simultaneously engaged and wise, earthly and spiritual, temporal and eternal, integrating all dimensions into wholeness, which is purpose and possibility of spiritual development, that Steiner outlined as a practical path that anyone can follow when they have the sincerity and dedication required to work patiently through years, cultivating conscious relationship between aspects of being that everyone possesses, but most never develop, by remaining divided within, without recognizing that division can be transformed into integration through work. That, although challenging, is also rewarding, bringing satisfaction that completely transcends temporary pleasures of material life, offering profound fulfillment that comes from living in alignment with the truth of who you truly are, recognizing that there are two you, the one who lives and the one who observes living, and that both are necessary and valuable, contributing to the totality of human experience, that when lived consciously, recognizing and integrating both levels becomes an authentic expression of potentials that are unique to each individuality, but that all share the basic structure of having both the lower self and the higher self operating simultaneously, creating development possibilities that are a distinctive mark of being human, differentiating from other forms of life that do not have this dual structure, allowing conscious evolution, which is the destiny and privilege of humanity when it chooses to do the work of recognizing and integrating both aspects of nature that everyone possesses. But only through deliberate development they become conscious and harmonized, allowing the person to live fully, expressing the totality of being, rather than operating only from fragments, without ever realizing full potentials that wait to be manifested through the conscious work of spiritual development that is the calling and opportunity of every human being.